The fog clung to the cobblestone streets of Westfield, Pennsylvania, a small town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests that seemed to swallow all light. In the autumn of 1841, this was a place of industry and progress, where the smell of coal and iron permeated the air and the promise of prosperity drew settlers from across the young nation. But beneath the veneer of order and civility lurked something that defied explanation. Something that would haunt the town for generations to come. Between March and December of that fateful year, 17 people vanished without a trace. Only 6 were ever found. The official records, sealed by local authorities and only unsealed in 1923, revealed a pattern so disturbing that many refused to believe it was the work of a human hand. Letters exchanged between Westfield's sheriff and officials in Philadelphia spoke of wounds that defy medical understanding and a method that suggests knowledge beyond our current scientific understanding. Are you brave enough to learn the truth about the Westfield disappearances? For decades, historians and criminologists have debated the nature of these crimes, attributing them to everything from wild animal attacks to ritualistic cult activity. But the truth is far more unsettling. It wasn't madness or supernatural forces at work in Westfield. It was something far more terrifying. The calculated curiosity of a mind that saw humanity as merely an experiment. Westfield in 1841 was a town divided by class and suspicion. The Industrial Revolution had transformed this once quiet farming community into a bustling center of commerce, with its iron foundry employing over 200 men. The Monongahela River carried goods and people to and from the town, but it also brought isolation during the harsh Pennsylvania winters when ice and snow could cut the settlement off for weeks at a time. The sound of the foundry's great hammers echoed through the valley from dawn till dusk, a constant reminder of progress and change. The air hung heavy with coal dust that settled on windowsills and clothing, turning white shirts gray by midday. At night, the town fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional howl of distant wolves and the creaking of wooden buildings settling in the cold. Dr. Elias Pemberton stood as the town's most respected citizen, a physician trained at the University of Pennsylvania who had returned to his hometown to establish a small but well-equipped medical practice. Tall and slender, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look through rather than at people, Pemberton was known for his brilliant mind and unwavering dedication to scientific advancement. His home, a grand 3-story Georgian structure on the hill overlooking the town, housed not only his family but also his private laboratory, where he conducted research that he claimed would revolutionize our understanding of human physiology. The town council, comprised of the foundry owner George Whitaker, Reverend Thomas Holloway of the Methodist Church, and several local businessmen, deferred to Pemberton on all matters medical and scientific. They saw in him the promise of bringing modern ideas to their growing town, elevating Westfield above the surrounding communities still mired in superstition and folk remedies. The social dynamics of 1841 America shaped every aspect of life in Westfield. Women were expected to remain in the domestic sphere, with hysteria and nervous conditions commonly diagnosed for any behavior that challenged male authority. The emerging field of medical science clashed with religious explanations for illness and death, creating tension between Pemberton and Reverend Holloway. The growing industrial working class lived in crowded conditions near the foundry, while the wealthy built homes on the hills above the smoke and noise. It was in this atmosphere of change and underlying tension that the first signs appeared, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Samuel Cooper, a 12-year-old boy who helped his father deliver milk before dawn, was the first to notice something amiss. On a foggy April morning, as he guided his cart through the streets, he saw a figure emerging from the woods that bordered the eastern edge of town. The figure carried something large wrapped in canvas, moving with purpose toward Dr. Pemberton's home. Samuel thought little of it until he saw the trail of dark droplets on the path behind the mysterious visitor. "Ma said I shouldn't talk about it," Samuel later told Sheriff William Harding, said it wasn't proper to spy on our betters. But I know what I saw. And the smell, like the butcher's shop on a hot day. I can't forget that smell. Sheriff Harding, a veteran of the War of 1812 with a reputation for thoroughness, made note of the boy's statement, but dismissed it as childish imagination. When 3 more residents reported unusual nighttime activity around the doctor's home in the following weeks, Harding paid a courtesy call to Pemberton, who laughed off the concerns. "My research often requires unusual hours, Sheriff," Pemberton explained, showing Harding his laboratory filled with gleaming instruments and jars of preserved specimens. "The pursuit of knowledge doesn't adhere to a conventional schedule." The sheriff left, satisfied, but Samuel Cooper couldn't forget what he'd seen. The image of that hunched figure dragging its heavy burden through the mist haunted his dreams. He began to watch the doctor's house from the cover of the woods, keeping a small journal of comings and goings. When he tried to show this journal to Reverend Holloway after Sunday service, his father cuffed him on the ear and apologized profusely to the embarrassed clergyman. 2 days later, Samuel Cooper disappeared on his morning route. His milk cart was found abandoned on the road, the horse still in its traces, patiently waiting for a driver who would never return. By summer, the pattern had become clear to anyone willing to see it. People would go missing, mostly workers from the foundry or young women from the poorer quarter of town, people whose absence might not immediately raise alarm. Days or weeks later, some would return, but profoundly changed. Margaret Sloane, a vibrant young woman who had worked as a laundress for several prominent families, vanished for 11 days in June. When she reappeared, she was found wandering near the river, her clothing soaked and her eyes vacant. Her mother barely recognized the daughter who had once sung as she worked. "It's Margaret, but it ain't her," Elizabeth Sloane confided to her neighbor. "The girl I raised had spirit and fire. This one, she just sits and stares. Won't say where she was. Flinches at every touch, and them marks on her neck and wrists, like she was held down. Something terrible's happened to my girl." Other families reported similar changes. Men once known for their strength and character became docile and confused. Children previously full of energy now sat quietly for hours, their eyes fixed on nothing. All bore similar marks, small, precise incisions behind the ears or at the base of the skull that healed into nearly invisible scars. Dr. Pemberton was called to examine several of these changed individuals, and in each case, his diagnosis was the same: nervous exhaustion or hysteria brought on by trauma. He prescribed rest, laudanum, and isolation from excitement or stimulation. The families, desperate for answers, accepted his authority without question. After all, he was the only physician within 30 miles, and his credentials were impeccable. But one woman refused to accept the mysterious changes that had befallen her brother. Eleanor Wright, 26 years old and unmarried, had raised her younger brother James since their parents died of typhoid fever years earlier. James, a skilled blacksmith at the foundry, disappeared for 8 days in August. When he returned, the strong, laughing young man had been replaced by a shell who stared vacantly and followed simple commands but rarely spoke. "That's not my James," Eleanor insisted to anyone who would listen. "Someone's done something to him. I want the sheriff to investigate." Eleanor was everything that society found problematic in a woman of that era. Educated beyond what was considered necessary, outspoken and fiercely independent. She had supported herself and James by keeping the town's financial ledgers, her mathematical mind earning grudging respect from the businessmen who employed her. But now, her insistence that something sinister had happened to her brother was dismissed as feminine hysteria. "Miss Wright is understandably distraught," Dr. Pemberton told the town council. "Her brother's condition is unfortunate, but not unprecedented. The mind, when faced with unknown trauma, often retreats into itself as a protective measure. My treatments will, in time, restore him." Eleanor knew better. She had seen the small, precise scar at the base of James's skull, hidden beneath his hair. She had watched him respond to certain phrases with mechanical obedience while remaining indifferent to others. Most disturbing of all, she had found him one night standing in their kitchen, methodically cutting his own palm with a knife, watching the blood flow with detached curiosity until she screamed and took the blade from his unresisting hand. With no one willing to help her, Eleanor began her own investigation. By day, she maintained her bookkeeping work, presenting the calm, professional demeanor expected of her. By night, she observed her brother, documenting every strange behavior in a journal bound in black leather. She noted the times when Dr. Pemberton's assistant came to administer treatments to James, tinctures that left him even more vacant for hours afterward. Eleanor began to follow the doctor's assistant after these visits, tracking his movements through town. She noticed a pattern. The assistant would make similar calls to other recovered individuals before returning to Pemberton's home. One night, she overheard a conversation between the assistant and Margaret Sloane's mother that chilled her blood. "The doctor requires her presence tomorrow night," the assistant said. "It's vital for her continued recovery." "But it's the third time this month," Mrs. Sloane protested weakly. "She comes back worse each time, not better. Dr. Pemberton's methods require consistency, unless you prefer to see your daughter institutionalized in Philadelphia. The doctor has connections who would take her case." The threat hung in the air, and Mrs. Sloane relented. Eleanor slipped away before she could be discovered, her mind racing. That night, she began mapping the pattern of disappearances and returns on a town map hidden beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. She collected samples of the medicines given to James, sealed them in small glass vials, and hid them alongside her growing documentation. The more Eleanor observed, the more she realized that the treatments were gradually intensifying. James was called to Pemberton's home with increasing frequency. Each time he returned more distant, with fresh marks that he could not or would not explain. She began to hear him mumbling numbers and Latin phrases in his sleep, reciting them like a student memorizing lessons. As autumn painted the Pennsylvania hills in crimson and gold, Eleanor discovered the locked drawer in James's workshop. Inside was a journal, written in her brother's hand, but in a style entirely unlike him. Clinical, detached observations of his own physical sensations, emotional responses, and dreams. The entries began shortly after his return and continued in daily increments, each one more disturbing than the last. Subject experiences increased sensitivity to light in left eye, pain response delayed by approximately 4 seconds when stimulus applied to right arm. Memory recall functions normal for events prior to procedure, but fragmented for recent events. The journal was addressed to Dr. Pemberton. James was somehow being compelled to experiment on himself and document the results. Eleanor knew then that she would be next. She had asked too many questions, observed too carefully. She had seen Dr. Pemberton watching her from across the street, his assistant making inquiries about her habits and routines. It was only a matter of time before she too disappeared, returning as a hollow version of herself, if she returned at all. She prepared meticulously. She hid copies of her documentation in 3 separate locations around town. She entrusted a sealed letter to a traveling merchant bound for Philadelphia to be delivered to a former professor of hers at the women's seminary she had attended. She sewed a small pocket into her undergarments where she concealed her most damning evidence, a sample of the medicine and a folded page of her brother's journal. On a cold October night, when the wind howled through the bare branches of the trees, there came a knock at Eleanor's door. Dr. Pemberton stood on her porch, his tall figure silhouetted against the darkness, his medical bag in hand. "Miss Wright," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I've come about James. I'm concerned about his progress and believe more intensive treatment is required. I've arranged for him to stay at my home for observation." Behind him stood his assistant and 2 strong men from the foundry. Men who had themselves disappeared and returned changed months earlier. They waited impassively, their eyes flat and empty. Eleanor knew this was the moment she had feared. "Of course, Doctor. Let me gather some of his things." Her voice betrayed none of the terror flooding through her veins. As she moved through the house collecting James's belongings, she whispered urgently to her brother, trying to reach whatever remained of him. "James, listen to me. When you hear the church bell toll midnight, run. Head for the river. A boat will be waiting." She had bribed a riverboat captain to be ready, using nearly all her saved money. But James only stared at her with those vacant eyes, his head tilting slightly, as though listening to something only he could hear. And in that moment, Eleanor realized with horror that her brother was beyond reaching. Whatever Pemberton had done to him had gone too deep. That night, as Dr. Pemberton and his men took James away, Eleanor implemented her desperate plan. She couldn't save her brother, but she could expose the truth. She waited until midnight, then slipped out her back window as the church bell began to toll. Instead of heading to the river as she had told James, she made her way through the shadows toward Pemberton's hillside mansion. The autumn storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, sending sheets of rain cascading from the sky. Lightning illuminated the imposing structure in brief, ghostly flashes as Eleanor circled to the rear of the property. A servant's entrance, left carelessly unlocked, provided her access to the house. The thunder masked her footsteps as she navigated the darkened corridors, following the sound of voices that echoed from below. A hidden door in Pemberton's study led to a staircase descending into darkness. Eleanor's heart pounded so violently she feared it might betray her presence, but the voices grew louder, drowning out her terror. At the bottom of the stairs, a long corridor led to a chamber illuminated by gas lamps that cast an unhealthy yellow glow over the scene before her. The room was a grotesque merger of surgical theater and scientific laboratory. Glass cabinets lined the walls, filled with specimens and instruments that Eleanor's mind refused to fully comprehend. In the center stood an operating table where James lay motionless, stripped to the waist, leather restraints binding his limbs. Dr. Pemberton bent over him, speaking in low, measured tones to three men in surgical aprons who attended him like acolytes. "Subject 17 continues to demonstrate remarkable adaptability," Pemberton was saying. "The cerebral access point has remained viable through 4 successive procedures without infection or rejection. Today, we expand the scope to include the secondary motor cortex." From her hiding place behind a tall cabinet, Eleanor could see other figures in the room. Patients who had disappeared and returned, changed, now moving with mechanical precision as they assisted with the unthinkable procedure. Margaret Sloane methodically arranged surgical tools on a tray, her once expressive face blank as a china doll's. Samuel Cooper, the missing milk boy, carefully transcribed Pemberton's words in a leather-bound journal. "The university remains interested in our findings," Pemberton continued. "Their last correspondence indicated that our techniques far surpass anything being attempted in Europe. They've requested comprehensive documentation for the upcoming symposium in Vienna." Eleanor bit back a gasp. This wasn't the work of a lone madman, but part of a larger scientific endeavor, sanctioned and supported by respected institutions. The realization made the horror before her even more unbearable. As Pemberton lifted a gleaming instrument that resembled a silver compass with a needle-sharp point, Eleanor couldn't contain a small sound of distress. The doctor paused, his head turning slightly toward her hiding place. With every ounce of courage she possessed, Eleanor backed away, then turned and fled up the stairs and through the house. The storm had intensified, turning the ground to mud that sucked at her boots as she ran toward town. She had seen enough, more than enough, to confirm her worst fears. She needed to reach someone who would believe her, someone with the authority to stop Pemberton's monstrous work. Sheriff Harding's home was dark when she pounded on the door, gasping for breath, rain plastering her hair to her face. When he finally appeared, squinting with sleep and irritation, Eleanor poured out her story in a desperate rush of words. "Miss Wright, please," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "You're distraught. Dr. Pemberton informed me of your brother's condition and your emotional state. He suspected you might fabricate some wild tale." "He's experimenting on people," Eleanor cried. "On their minds. I have proof." She reached for the hidden pocket in her undergarments, but the evidence she had so carefully preserved was gone, either lost in her flight or, more terrifyingly, taken from her without her knowledge. Sheriff Harding's expression hardened from irritation to concern. "I think you'd better come inside, Miss Wright. I'll send for Dr. Pemberton. He can give you something to calm your nerves." Eleanor backed away, the betrayal cutting deeper than fear. "He's gotten to you too," she whispered, "or you're a willing part of it." She turned and ran again, this time toward the river where she had arranged passage. But the docks were deserted, the promised boat nowhere in sight. Whether the captain had betrayed her or simply decided the storm made travel too dangerous, Eleanor would never know. For 3 days, she hid in an abandoned trapper's cabin in the woods, planning her next move. On the 4th morning, she awoke to find the cabin surrounded by townspeople led by Sheriff Harding and Dr. Pemberton. "Eleanor," the doctor called, his voice gentle with concern. "We're worried about you. Your brother is asking for you. Please let us help." From the narrow window, she could see James standing among them, his face as blank as ever. Beside him stood other recovered patients, all watching the cabin with the same empty stare. She had no weapon, no means of escape, and no one left to trust. When the authorities finally entered the abandoned cabin on that cold November morning, Eleanor Wright was gone. A thorough search of the surrounding woods yielded nothing. The only trace of her presence was a small leather-bound journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard, its pages filled with increasingly frantic observations and accusations that painted a disturbing picture of a mind unraveling into paranoia and delusion. "Poor woman," Dr. Pemberton remarked to Sheriff Harding as they concluded their search. "To be so consumed by unfounded suspicions. I only wish she had accepted my help before her condition deteriorated so severely." In December 1841, a final entry was made in the official record of the Westfield disappearances. Eleanor Wright was presumed dead, likely drowned in the Monongahela River during her flight from imagined persecution. The case was closed, the files sealed by order of the county judge. Dr. Elias Pemberton continued his practice in Westfield for another 7 years before accepting a prestigious position at a new neurological institute in Boston. His published papers on cerebral influence and behavioral modification earned him international recognition in medical circles. The techniques he pioneered would later influence treatments for mental deficiency and moral insanity throughout the American asylum system for decades to come. In 1923, when the sealed records were finally opened as part of a historical society project, researchers found Eleanor Wright's journal among the documents. Its final pages contained detailed maps of a series of caves along the riverbank where she claimed evidence of unspeakable procedures was hidden. A subsequent expedition found the caves collapsed. Whether by natural forces or human intervention, no one could determine. James Wright lived to the age of 76, working as Dr. Pemberton's laboratory assistant until the doctor's death, then as a janitor at the town hospital. He never married, never spoke of his sister, and left no writings of his own. The only peculiarity noted at his death was an unusual scar tissue formation found at the base of his skull, a curiosity that the examining physician documented but could not explain. When science divorces itself from conscience, progress becomes merely a new form of darkness, one cloaked in rationality and respectability, and all the more dangerous for its disguise.